Some first line of defence teams have been trained to think that if someone can't answer questions straight away, then they're suspicious.
Fraudsters prey on marginalised communities, right?
So if you don't fit into the mould, sorry, tough luck. That's your problem, not ours.
How can businesses actually ensure their digital services are inclusive and accessible to these groups?
I think 2025 is going to be a really interesting year for this topic.
Fraud prevention isn't just a business problem. It's a shared responsibility across governments, companies, and the individuals.
I think that if you were to say to your exec, we've lost £2 million to fraud last year, they'll go, yep, have some money, sort out the problem, off you go. Whereas if you say, I could save you $2 billion, they'll go, how much is it going to cost?
It's a very tough job.
Everybody loses out, but I don't think people realise that.
Hello and welcome to What the Fraud, a podcast by Sumsub where digital fraudsters meet their match. I'm Thomas Taraniuk, currently responsible for some of our very exciting partnerships here at Sumsub, the global digital verification platform helping to verify users, businesses, and of course, transactions as well. Fraud might seem like a victimless crime or an isolated issue, but when we take a closer look, it often acts as a powerful engine for bias, disproportionately targeting marginalized communities and fueling inequality. In this episode today, we're looking at how fraud fuels discrimination in the digital age and what actions stakeholders can take to address the issue. An issue that runs deeper than most of us imagine. Today's guest is Claire Maillet, an award-winning leader in financial crime prevention, counter-fraud expert, PhD researcher, and a passionate advocate for disability and mental health awareness as well. When Claire isn't driving transformative change by leading technical teams and shaping fraud-related products across Europe, she takes the stage internationally as a keynote speaker and podcast host. Claire's efforts in bringing fraud awareness to the forefront, as well as exploring mental well-being, is truly inspiring. So, Claire, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. That introduction was incredibly kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us on What the Fraud. I'm really looking forward to our conversation here today. Claire, I wanted to start by learning more about your work in spreading awareness of fraud controls and speech impediments, a topic, of course, which we haven't touched on here at What the Fraud before, and one that's also incredibly important to highlight. So even in early 2024, the UK government introduced a Disability Action Plan, aiming to make the UK the most accessible place in the world. However, the plan did not mention invisible disabilities, only physical and visible ones. And I understand that you help companies, Claire, reevaluate their processes and adapt their policies accordingly.
Yes, that's right. Yes. It's a subject that I am obviously very passionate about. As you'll notice, that I do have a stammer. I've had one for 28 years. Sometimes I can go for a whole day without stammering, and other days I can't say a single thing. So with regards to the work that I do, I advise companies and also universities on how they can best support their colleagues, staff, students who stammer. It only really came to me in the summer that I can actually combine these two into one presentation that I've just started and delivering. And it's looking at how a customer with a speech impediment of some kind might be unfairly or unknowingly penalised when it comes to counter-fraud controls, both from the onboarding perspective, but also from the transaction monitoring perspective as well. It's one of those things where people don't realise they need to know about it until after they've heard it. And they go, oh, it's so obvious now. It's so obvious that the way that we do things inside our organisation could be penalising people unfairly.
Absolutely, it's an important conversation to have. So Claire, could you share some of the valuable insights you've learned since starting this conversation?
Yeah, on the whole, I think it's around 3% of adults in the UK stammer. So if you think about a company that has 50 million customers, they're going to have a lot of customers who stammer. Now, whether that's knowingly or not knowingly, some people who stammer don't want to disclose it. So that sort of adds another layer of complexity with regards to organizations as well. And I think that from a transaction monitoring perspective, there is a real risk of people with invisible disabilities, not just stammering, but invisible disabilities being unfairly debanked. And obviously, earlier in 2024, that sort of became a key talking point. And I think from a disabilities perspective, I think it's very discriminatory. It goes against the Equality Act 2010, as well as Consumer Duty of Care. And so, for example, the questions that people may ask during the identity verification process on the phone, so can you confirm your first name, surname, date of birth? These are all things that, if people who stammer don't want to reveal that they stammer, they will substitute words. For example, if I wanted to order a coffee in a coffee shop, if I want to hide my stammer, I might end up ordering something completely different, but all for saving face to be able to hide my stammer. And that also comes to when you have to say your name in certain coffee shops, because they don't ask for ID, thank goodness. Otherwise, I'd be completely screwed. But I don't have to say my actual name. I can say any name that I like. Whereas for information that you can't change, so your personal details, for example, that makes ID and V a real problem for some people. And especially because some first line of defense teams have been trained to think that if someone can't answer questions straight away, then they're suspicious. Whereas actually it's a lack of understanding about that's just how some people speak.
Got you, Claire. But how does digital discrimination, let's say, influence who becomes the end victim of this type of fraud, let's say?
I think with regards to who becomes the victim, I mean, definitely the individual with the disability is going to be left out, but also it leaves the organisation in a vulnerable position as well, because anyone has the right to go to the financial ombudsman to complain. And whether or not that company is going to win or lose the case, they will be charged a fee of £750. So actually everyone loses out to an extent. But I think that people with invisible disabilities may not necessarily know that they can do that, because stammering is considered a disability by some, but not by others. And that's because of the definition of the word and disability. By law, it impacts different people in different ways, and therefore not everyone considers their stammer to be a disability. But in answer to your question, everybody loses out, but I don't think people realise that.
Got you. People need to access not only physical services, but of course digital services, right? Especially in today's day and age where most things are now done online. I mean, you can even order your coffee, for your example, online, delivered to your door, etc. So are there any specific, let's say, industries, Claire, or platforms, let's say, which are disproportionately enabling fraud?
I think that all organisations need to ensure that everything that they're doing is accessible. And I'm not saying that, at the very beginning stages of a company being founded, I'm not saying that right at that stage they say, right, so before we decide on our customer model, we need to ensure that people who stammer aren't unfairly treated. I'm not saying that should be the case. But I think that with regards to product teams and tech teams and design teams and customer service teams, I think there's an overwhelming assumption that all of those teams are going to have mostly, if not all, people who don't have a disability or a difference of some kind. So therefore, those things aren't going to be taken into consideration. Whereas if those teams, for example, in customer services, had someone who had a speech impediment, or if a tech team or a design team had someone who was hearing impaired or speech impaired, say, then that's automatically going to feed into the conversation, because the people that impacts are directly in your team. It also comes down to the hiring. So the people that are going to be using your product, that's tested by people internally. But if they don't represent all of your users, then you're unknowingly going to exclude a lot of people.
Yeah, fraudsters prey on marginalized groups, communities, right? And traditionally speaking, that would be elderly people. You hear a lot of these call scams, etc. People who are alone and isolated, and these groups will form the basis of targeting these individuals, where financial crime, let's say, impacts society massively as well within these communities. So we do need to do more to combat it. Why do you think fraudsters focus on these marginalized groups? What makes them more attractive targets? And do you believe people with invisible disabilities could be a potential target for organized criminal groups?
That's a really interesting question. I think that those people are less likely to speak up, to disclose, to come forward to friends, family, law enforcement, etc. I think there's that element of shame, because you could argue that they are already in a vulnerable position because of their disability, because of their personal circumstances. And so to add an extra layer on top of that of because of how I am, I've now been taken advantage of. I think that that's potentially why. I think that they're just seen as easier targets. And I've not necessarily seen it with those with the invisible disabilities, but I think that because everything's going digital, everything's going online or in-app, I think that it's definitely making it easier. Because by making things more accessible to those who are more vulnerable, to those who are normally excluded from these things, you're automatically making it more accessible to fraudsters. So it's definitely a double-edged sword, I would say.
I would agree with that as well. And is that how you think digital discrimination influences, let's say, who becomes also a victim of fraud at the end of the day?
Yeah, because if you have people who can't access services in the normal, quote unquote, way, then they're going to need extra measures, extra assistance, and different processes to assist them. And so they're going to make it easier for the customer to access because of their needs, but also it's going to make it easier for criminals to bypass. So I think there's a balance there between making it easier for customers to access their products and their services, but in a way that it's still being able to protect them from economic crime as well.
Got you. Thank you so much for that, Claire. We're going to take a quick break now and get right back into it. This conversation highlights how fraud disproportionately affects marginalized communities, deepening digital inequality. That's where Green Flag, a project we're incredibly proud of here at Sumsub, comes in. So imagine this. 620 million people worldwide, almost $2 trillion in spending power, are excluded from digital services due to barriers such as outdated IDs or appearance changes. We at Sumsub understand the hardships faced by those excluded in the digital world. With innovative solutions like non-document verification, we're empowering governments and businesses alike to include people from all backgrounds and ensure everyone can access the services they need. So you can learn more about Green Flag at greenflag.me, and let's ensure no one is left behind in the digital world. Welcome back to today's episode of What the Fraud. Today, we're looking at fraud being a driver of discrimination with Claire Maillet. Claire is a counter-fraud leader with more than a decade of experience, so it's a privilege to have her join us.
Thank you.
At Sumsub, we believe in creating a people-friendly digital future, one where every honest user can access essential services no matter where they're from or what challenges that they face. This mission has inspired us to launch Green Flag, a campaign addressing digital inequality, and our research has revealed that over 627 million people globally are locked out of digital services, representing over 1.8 trillion US dollars in untapped economic potential. This exclusion is due to four main barriers: outdated ID formats, a lack of digital literacy, changes in appearance, and systematic bias tied to the country of origin as well. So, Claire, our question to you: why do you think digital exclusion remains a widespread issue, even in 2024? And how does the number of 627 million sound to you?
Well, that number's pretty big. I think that's the technical term. It's pretty big, isn't it? It's kind of scary to think that that many people, and actually that much of a contribution to the economy, is being lost. I think that it does call for widespread change, and that, I think, takes from its core, it's education. And I think that there's this societal view that people with invisible disabilities need to conform to the societal norms that we were raised in. So if you don't fit into the mold, sorry, tough luck. That's your problem, not ours. My take on it is, why are we trying to change the 3% of people who stammer in the UK? Why aren't we educating the 97% of people who don't? And obviously, if you look at 97% versus 3%, obviously it would seem easier to target the 3% because that number's considerably smaller than the 97% of people who don't stammer. But in order to create a fully inclusive and digitally accessible industry, people need to understand these disabilities, these conditions, how they impact people and how they impact the customer journey. So people in the industry might know that I have a stammer, and that's great, but I wouldn't expect people to say, but I wonder how that impacts her as the customer of a bank. And I wonder how that will result in us needing to have a look at our processes to make sure that she's not being excluded. So I think that even though people will perhaps know that I stammer, it's then taking it that next step further. And I think that's down to your design teams, your tech teams, customer services teams.
Of course, you'll need someone in the hiring department who knows what to spot for and also the policies in place. So I feel like there's this intricate web which makes it a good environment to actually involve individuals who can actually contribute to this change.
Absolutely. And I think it also comes down to training for individuals too. So in universities, you'll find that all staff have to undergo mandatory training for mental health and disabilities. But you'll find that those are very high level, and they don't go into a great deal of detail. And I'm not saying that every single disability training should go through every single disability that's out there. Otherwise, we'd never get any work done. But I think that with regards to those which impact the customer journey more, I feel like those should sort of be at the top. And I think that the best way to learn from those people are to get those people into companies talking about their experiences. When I've been delivering my talks on the impact of speech impediments on counter fraud controls, it's because I can be in a very privileged position in that I can come at it from both sides, because I'm both a customer who stammers and I'm also a counter-fraud professional working in financial services. So I think it's also looking at the training of staff as a whole. So we all undergo the financial crime training and data privacy training, all of that. I've never been on mental health training or disability training within financial services, even when I've had to deal with customers. So I think it's also taking a look at how are your staff educated.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you there. I mean, we talk about education a lot, especially on our podcast. I mean, pretty much every single episode. I think it's the best, most important, at least, factor when we're talking about people protecting themselves more so. We've talked about the onus being on businesses sometimes, but also the onus being on the individual. Another significant challenge is digital literacy, particularly for older populations or underserved communities as well. The annual report by the Federal Trade Commission to Congress revealed that older Americans lost close to $2 billion to fraud in 2023 alone, with unreported cases possibly reaching over $60 billion. So our question to you, Claire, how can businesses and governments tailor fraud prevention tools for older users without reducing usability?
I think, again, it comes down to education. I'm always slightly wary of for organisations being told that they have to have all of this tooling in place. They have to have the latest tech, the best analysts, because you can give a company all of the budget in the world. You can give them the best staff. You can get them the latest tech, but there's only so much persuading of a customer that something is suspicious that you can do. And you can persuade them all the way up to the point where they press that button to send funds or to disclose personal information. And I think that it really just depends on to what extent organizations are going to educate their customers. I once worked in a fintech where I wanted to add a control in. So in our SMS one-time passcodes messages, I wanted to add the sentence, please don't share this with anyone. You know, just like, and it's just a very, very simple sentence that you see a lot nowadays. And I was told by my exec team that to add that sentence in would cost over £150,000. So they weren't going to bother. And you think, yeah, but that's probably going to save you millions in fraud losses. So you're not wanting to spend the upfront cost in order to potentially prevent all of this fraud. And I think that if you were to say to your exec, we've lost £2 million to fraud last year, they'll go, yep, have some money, sort out the problem, off you go. Whereas if you say, I could save you $2 billion, they'll go, yeah, how much is it going to cost? So I think it comes down to the education and the risk appetite. And I think that that's the case for customers as well as organizations.
100%. Well, it's not just on the organizations front. I know that we talked about that and the customers and educating them, but we've discussed even in our last episode, fraud prevention isn't just a business problem. It's a shared responsibility across governments, let's say companies and the individuals themselves as well. So education and awareness campaigns hopefully help to bridge this gap. But I would ask you, Claire, how can a global, let's say, partnership or partnerships foster a unified approach within this industry?
I think it needs to come from the very top. And the reason why I say that is because I think we're also at risk of over collaboration, which I know will make some people fall off their chair because that goes against the grain of what we're supposed to be doing. But I think that whilst collaboration is obviously brilliant, I think there is the risk of forming too many silos, essentially, by trying to collaborate. So you see all of these groups being set up, which is brilliant, and all of these organizations, these charities, to be able to tackle a certain part of the fraud landscape. But if we create too many of those, we could be exacerbating the problem because we're creating more silos as a result of trying to create fewer silos. I think another issue is the lack of standardization, because fraud data is obviously key. That's how we are able to measure what we're doing, to measure what works, what doesn't work. And I think that given that there is no standardization across the globe with regards to let alone the and definition of fraud, but also the data that we have and the data that we can share and which organizations collect which data, it's all very disjointed. And so it's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, it isn't working. But I feel like we need to acknowledge that there are problems first. And I think that the data and the standardization of that is one of the foundations of being able to accurately measure what the problem is and the scale of the problem, because fraud can't be really accurately measured. And I think that the data that underpins that needs to be fixed, potentially, in order to help us to understand the problem. Because if we can't understand the problem, how can we try and solve the problem in an effective way?
Not everyone also has a platform, right? And we'll be able to explain the issues at hand. Of course, you need data to back that up. But when we're talking about maybe a listener on this call who may have an invisible disability, as we'd say, how can this individual, let's say, advocate for themselves if they're excluded or discriminated against by a fraud prevention system, a protocol, or just resonate quite heavily with what we're talking about today?
It's a very tricky one, because some people will willingly disclose their disability and others will not. And I think it's unfair to be forced into that position or to feel like you have to disclose when you aren't comfortable doing so. So for those people who have a disability, who have a difference of some kind, don't feel forced into disclosing when you're not ready, because that can have substantial psychological impact as a result of that. However, if you have friends or family and colleagues who can help you with that, who can be your allies, who can be your spokespeople, until you get to that point of, actually, I think now's the time for me to do this myself, then I think that that's one of the best assets that you can have, is people on your side, people who are your cheerleaders, who understand what it's like and who can help you fight those battles.
100%. And I would say, I mean, you've given so much great practical advice there, to obviously for the individual's sake, but also for businesses as well. Not everyone also has, well, of course, the structure around them maybe to sort of break that cycle and actually and get out there. And of course, with companies and organisations, there needs to be more onus on them for educating the public that it is okay to come forward, that they do have the controls in place, which are going to allow individuals to access inclusive, let's say, digital services as well. Claire, looking ahead to 2025, what trends or innovations could significantly reduce digital fraud and also at the same time promote equality?
So I think 2025 is going to be a really interesting year for this topic, because the European Accessibility Act is due to come out in 2025, which is doing similar things to what Consumer Duty of Care is doing in the UK. It's aiming to make all products and all services accessible to everyone. I think that with regards to how that impacts fraud controls, it's going to force companies to understand how the customers that they are knowingly or unknowingly excluding, how they are impacted. And as a result of that, I think it's going to open up their eyes to how fraud can be perpetrated against these marginalized groups, and therefore more mitigating factors that need to be put in place. So I think it's going to be one of learning. It's going to be a year of education, a year of empathy, perhaps, to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. We all need to be open to the idea that actually we may not have done things right in the past. And that now is the time to actually rethink that, to go back to the drawing board, start again, and to ensure that actually we are including everyone, because people with and disabilities and differences will already feel excluded from large parts of society. So as organisations offering products, offering services, it's our duty to ensure that they aren't feeling more excluded than they already are.
Definitely. It's about their own access, of course, to digital services, which of course make lives easier, better. But also these businesses need to understand, if they are innovating in 2025, to include hundreds of millions of individuals which otherwise would not have access to their services, that it is also a very good thing on their side. They will be, let's say, onboarding new users, providing them services which allow them to move their life in a very positive direction. But of course, allow them to bring those people into the fold, into a community of people who are sharing, whether or not it's monetary, marketplaces, or otherwise, information and other means as well. So Claire, thank you very much for covering such an important topic with me.
Thank you very much. And thank you for letting me talk about this specific subject, because I feel like sometimes the platforms for talking about fraud-related topics are very much focused on the same things. So the perfect customer journey, the new legislation, all that kind of thing. So to be able to sort of break the norm and to talk about this means a lot. So thank you very much.
Our pleasure, honestly. It's nice to take, as you said, a new direction with the conversations that we do have on What the Fraud. Before we go, I wanted to ask you a few final questions, if that's all right. And we'd like to end the show, if you've seen the episodes before, through 5 quick-fire questions. So are you ready?
Yes.
Fantastic. No pressure, Claire. When choosing a digital wallet, do you go for more features or better security?
Better security. Easy.
Better security. Okay, great. Great answer. I'd say the same. Strong passwords or biometric authentication?
Biometric authentication, if done correctly.
Fantastic. Number 3, is online fraud more about technology flaws or human error?
Human error.
Wonderful. And 4, what's one habit you rely on to stay safe online?
Gosh. Question everything. Don't trust anyone or anything, which makes me very cynical, but that's what I say.
Yeah, you need to do what you need to do. If you could have any other career than the one you're in, Claire, what would it be?
So up until my early 20s, I was going down the path of becoming a professional dancer. And then I was told to get a real job. So yeah, I would be a professional dancer.
Well, don't let your dreams be dreams. I still have my passion to be an astronaut still there, thriving.
Amazing.
Yeah. To wrap up today's episode, our 7th of season 2, I'd like to share some of our key reflections. So today we have learned a lot about inclusivity, the barriers to those affected by disabilities, whether or not they are visible or hidden. In fact, within the UK, we want to be the most accessible country in the world, but there is a lot of work to be done to get there. As according to the House of Commons, 16 million people in the UK, or 24% of the population, are considered disabled, whilst 1 to 3% of UK adults have a stammer. Claire has highlighted some important issues and also some of the key barriers or moats for those affected, where individuals who are unable to access digital services due to their disabilities may lose access to things that some of us may take for granted on a day-to-day basis, whilst the industries that would be serving them are unable to access a critical customer base. We discussed the importance of addressing this issue of access and the promotion of equality head-on, where I believe we can conclude that a unified approach is needed not only in the UK to make sure those affected have access to the services they need through fraud controls which are adapted to their requirements and onboarding journeys which take into account their disabilities, whether hidden or not. Education, I believe, comes first, top down from the government and then from industry leaders through campaigns both to educate the staff to implement the correct changes and controls, but also for the public so that they are aware they are able to access these services as well. Thank you everyone who has tuned in to season 2 so far. I hope you've gained valuable insights into the current landscape of fraud. As always, please like, comment, follow and subscribe wherever you're listening to us now. Any feedback you can give us is incredibly helpful and also makes it easier for others to find us. So if you want to hear more about what we do at Sumsub and how your business can benefit from our verification services, definitely check out our website at sumsub.com and subscribe to all our socials. Stay safe and join us next time.